Good afternoon and welcome to Savannah Book Festival's virtual author series. I'm Erica Dongray, Executive Director, and we're delighted to have you here this afternoon for James Lee Burke and John Connolly in conversation. John and James will answer questions submitted during today's conversation. To submit a question, simply click Ask a Question, which is at the bottom right of your screen. Type it in and hit enter, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. To purchase a copy of their books, The Dirty South and A Private Cathedral, click the green button just below the screen. And now to our two amazing authors. International bestseller John Connolly is the winner of a number of literary prizes for his work, including the Edgar, Seamus, and Anthony Awards, and the CWA Dagger. He is the author of the Charlie Parker series of thrillers, the Supernatural Collection Nocturnes, the Samuel Johnson trilogy for younger readers, and, with Jennifer Ridyard, the Chronicles of the Invader series. His latest book is The Dirty South, which just came out November 3rd. James Lee Burke is the New York Times bestselling author of A Private Cathedral, the 23rd in the Dave Robichaux series, and of 39 other novels and 2 short stories. He has been a Breadloaf Fellow and Guggenheim Fellow, has been awarded 2 Edgar Awards for Best Novel, the Grandmaster Award by the Mystery Writers of America, and his The Lost Get Back Boogie was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Welcome, John and James, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're so excited to have John all the way from Dublin and James all the way from Missoula. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. I think I'm going to jump in and take the lead because I come here as a bit like Muhammad coming to the mountain because Jim, as for a lot of writers of my generation, is a huge influence upon us and an important figure in a great many ways. And as somebody that I've known and admired for a very, very long time. But what I was curious about, Jim, I wanted to go back to the start a little bit. You've now been 55 years in print, which is quite an extraordinary achievement. I think the first book was published, Half of Paradise, in 1965. But I want to go back a little bit before that. I think people are often curious about the influences upon a writer, the writers that in turn created them. And I'm wondering, who are those writers for you? Who are the writers who begin? Because as writers, we're readers primarily, readers first and foremost. Who are the writers who set you on the path to becoming a writer in turn?
Stylistically, I think I was influenced most by, Ernest Hemingway, certainly, James T. Farrell, Flannery O'Connor, John Dos Passos, certainly, Steinbeck, big influence. In other words, the naturalist.
Okay. What about when we've spoken in the past? You've discussed Faulkner and Scott Fitzgerald. Did they come later for you?
Yeah. Well, I guess so. Probably my earliest influence, I was about 19, was John Steinbeck. Later, I discovered the work of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who, to my mind, is the most talented writer America ever produced. Maybe he's just one of the best writers of prose who ever lived. It's just extraordinary. He recreated or resurrected the what's called metaphysical image. George Herbert, John Donne, Andrew Marvell. At the same time, of course, the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. I'm convinced that Fitzgerald read Hopkins' notebooks.
But
the metaphysical image or metaphor is it forces comparisons of opposites. If you read Gerard Manley Hopkins' notebooks, I remember he's talking about riding on a train. He looks out the window and he said, I saw a lad burning a pile of honeysuckle, the fire whipping away like a yellow handkerchief. That's writing, by heavens.
What is interesting about those influences for me is that they are, you're not naming mystery writers in any way. And I'm wondering when I look at your work and when I look at the 2 series and the Holland books and the Robichaux novels, it sometimes strikes me that you came into the genre primarily looking at yourself as a novelist. Were you thinking in terms of genre when you began writing? or were you formed more by the concept of actually I'm primarily a novelist and genre is just a tool that I will apply to what I'm doing?
Well, I never read mysteries, and I'm not denigrating them, but I just was never drawn to them, other than the mystery that lies in all narration. We do not know how the story is going to end. That's what forces us on into the page and page and pages that we read. Uh, no, I have had a peculiar career. Uh, I wrote my first novel when I was 23, Half of Paradise, but it took me 5 years to get it in print. And then I published two more, and all of these with good houses, Houghton Mifflin, Charles Scribner. And I thought I was on board forever. And then I wrote The Lost Get Back Boogie, and I went 13 years out of hardback print. I wrote novels I never published during that period, but I could not sell anything. And my friend Rick DeMarinis and I were fishing, and he said, Jim, you've written every kind of novel except a crime novel. Why don't you give it a try? He said, all you got to do is write a couple of chapters and you probably get an advance. The next day, we were in Montana then. 3 days later, we were in San Francisco. I had a yellow tablet, legal tablet, and I walked down from Ferlinghetti's bookstore to a cafe, outdoor cafe, right across from a Catholic church, and I started writing The Neon Rain. That was it. It put me back in print. But I never thought of the books I wrote thereafter as mysteries. The Dave Robichaux books were the same books I'd always written, and they were narrated, though, by a voice of a man who was sometimes a police officer. Nothing changed in my work. My first novel was about convicts in Angola. My second novel was about the labor wars in the East Kentucky. It starts with the dynamiting of a coal tipple. My third book was about a Texas lawyer trying to get a Mexican union worker out of Huntsville Pen. So I've never changed my work.
What strikes me about all of those books and the work subsequently, and in the way you've just described them now, is that you seem to have from the start have had a very strong conception of justice, particularly social justice in your work. And that's something that has been maintained throughout. Do you see that as almost a pivotal theme in what you do?
Yes, I didn't set out with that intention. It's just the way I think I grew up. And also, film has had a lot of influence on my work. If I were teaching creative writing again, I would send people to the motion picture shows. There's a lot of things you can learn from the screen. But when I was growing up, I was born in the Depression. When I was growing up, the films were called now noir films, stories of the underworld, actually were sociological stories looking at America from the pavement up. And I never forgot that lesson I learned. The real story is not at the top, it's at the bottom, but you have to have the eye for it. So I've always felt that the ultimate story, as George Orwell said, is about the conflict between good and evil on a metaphysical basis, but sociologically, it's stories around us all the time. Right now, here in our country, we have been at great risk, I think, of losing our constitutional origins. And, it's been a very dangerous time, I think. It's not just something that happened 4 years ago. It's been with us since the 1830s, the nativist movement.
And to what extent have you confronted that in your own work, do you think? That conception of that stain that runs through in your view?
Well, I think it's always there. It's the power struggle. This is the history of the human race. It's always about power. It's never been about anything else. Jesus was murdered because he challenged the authorities there in the ancient world. St. Paul was put to death by Nero personally. I mean, he had Paul arrested. It's power. It's always there. It's in, look, think of it this way. I'm 83. All my life, I have tried to avoid people who I consider the arch enemies of everything, those who seek power over others. Once I sense that about anyone, I'm gone. And they're everywhere. And they're all basically narcissists. They're amoral, and the great injuries are not done by petty thieves. They're done by political people. Look at the damage done by Napoleon, Hitler. And we've had some lovely fellows over on this side of the pond as well. Hello? Hey, I'm afraid that my screen is frozen. Hello? Hello?
Hi. I think John's screen is muted. I mean, is frozen.
I see,
James,
yeah, his screen is frozen.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, so
So you can continue.
well, alrighty. I didn't mean to proselytize. In terms of narration, the the real story, the one that I think at least has influenced me most, is the legend of the Grail. This goes back
Mhm.
to the 5th century in Cornwall and Wales, and of course King Arthur. And there was a King Arthur, and there were knights of the Round Table. But that legend, the legend of the Grail, goes way back into mythology. And mythology, not as a pejorative, we use the term in a kind of derogatory way today. It's a metaphor for man's attempt to acquire divine light, to find divinity in some way, to find something greater than simply what seems to be the materialistic gifts of the world. But also, I'm influenced, I think, by an extension of the myth of the Grail, the Song of Roland, the wonderful medieval legend of the Battle of Roncesvalles, or Roncesvalles in French. And in fact, I had a peculiar experience with one of these companies that allows you to chase your genealogy. I took a specimen or I don't know, some kind of, I forget, I don't even think about that. I sent off probably, I don't know, a piece of my skin. And it took 2 months to get this evaluation. But my family were Black Irish. The Burke family, their name was originally de Burke, and he was an aristocrat, Norman Irish. We were always very proud of our lineage, and we all believed that actually my family had ties with Charles Martel and Charlemagne. And of course, it was Charlemagne who fought the Battle of Roncesvalles. And so I wanted to find out if it was true. Was my family really there at that 8th century battle? Yes, they were. Unfortunately, we were not the guys with Charlemagne. We belonged, my people from whom I descend, belong to these very primitive, almost hominids up here at the top of the Roncesvalles Pass, throwing rocks down on Charlemagne's head. But also, I found out I was related to John Wilkes Booth.
Oh, wow.
First, we find out that our ancestors were hardly human, and also I'm related to one of the worst people in United States history. I never had to seek humility. It always found me.
Oh, well, look, we got John back too.
All right.
I'm really sorry. The perils of technology, I'm afraid. But I did get to hear all of that, which is something. And apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
Yeah.
Maybe we could go back to the work, having had the conversation. I know your work moves between Louisiana and Montana quite frequently, and I'm wondering what it is that Louisiana offers that Montana doesn't, and vice versa, in the way you use landscape.
Well, Montana and Louisiana share much in common. Number one, the environment is stressed, and it's also stressed by extractive industries. And secondly, they're both cultures that are actually, they are sort of pieces of fiction frozen in time. They replicate the history of the United States, not just themselves. The American West, the entire story is replicated in the history of Montana from the time that the fur trappers came out here and the Astor family made a fortune in the fur trade. And eventually, the decimation of the Indian culture. The American West really closed down about 1876. Of course, that was the year when Custer was wiped out. And it was one of those battles that the Indians could not afford because they almost would just effaced right off of the map as a consequence. But the same battle is still there. The issue is the same issue of the First World War. T.E. Lawrence said it in 1950. The issue is petroleum or minerals, natural resources. It's still the issue. Nothing has changed. And Dave Robichaud says wars of enormous consequence are always fought in places no one cares about. In other words, it's disposable. That is the corporate attitude toward the state of Montana. It is also the attitude of the politicians and the extractive industry who have the same attitude toward this Edenic paradise. Now, this isn't meant to be a flagellation of extractive industries. My father was a natural gas engineer. I was a landman for Sinclair Oil Company. That's a guy who looks for openings, drilling places to drill. I worked a little bit on a seismic crew offshore. I was a pipeliner in Texas. In other words, in many ways, I went to school because I had a job with Sinclair Oil Company. They just treated me wonderfully. But in the oil business or the business of extractive industries, any kind, these guys do business with baseball bats, and they will tell you that. They don't hide it. All right, think of it this way. Wonderful film made by Marlon Brando. Excuse me. I've got something in my throat. Hang on. Marlon Brando in a film called The Formula. He plays the role of this totally obnoxious, unscrupulous Texas oil man whose partner in crime, corporate crimes, is a character named J.W. And J.W. says to the Marlon Brando character, "You know, Jimmy Lee, them damn Arabs is sure causing us a lot of trouble, ain't they?" And Marlon Brando's character, Jimmy Lee, says, "J.W., haven't you figured it out? Son, we are the damn Arabs." a bunch of people who ride camels who haven't even discovered the wheel, who had the good fortune to be born on top of this huge reservoir of oil. These are not the villains. It's J.W. and Jimmy Lee back there in Big Dallas. Yeah. I'm reminded of something. Remember the lady who actually helped found Israel, Goldie Meir? She said, only my people would wander for 2,000 years and finally settle in the only place in the Mideast that has no oil. Right. The screen is frozen again.
Yeah, I think we lost.
Okay.
I think John is frozen
Okay.
again, or he just can't stop laughing.
Okay. No. Pardon me. Well,
Oh no.
Erica did. So, well, I'm sorry that our technology is on the blink, but I hope everyone out there is not not leaving. But
No, because we have you here too, and we want to hear more.
yeah. Well, let's see. Are there people there who are can ask questions?
I do have a
Writing
question
or publishing
that I can ask, and we'll ask John later. Both of you have major characters that are flawed by their past. Do you think that is necessary for a series character?
Well, I have never thought about it in terms of a series character. I think about it more in the creation of any character. Okay, there are only two kinds of characters that appear in what we would call an epic story or literary story. And it's either the person is categorically a figure associated with pathos, or he is associated with the tragic hero. Now, pathos, according to Aristotle in his great book, Poetics, the pathos does not allow catharsis. Instead, it excites in us feelings of depression. We feel offended, but there's no resolution in the play, meaning hence no catharsis, purgation. All right. I've tried to avoid writing pathos because it leads us into depression. It's kind of circular and maudlin sometimes. And Dave Robichaux, I think, is a popular character or narrator because he's actually out of the Elizabethan theater. Think of it another way. Why is The Godfather 1, perhaps maybe the best motion picture ever made, bar none? It is a masterpiece. Shakespeare could have written. It is a success story because it's right out of the Elizabethan era. It is not about the mob. The mob is made up of people who on their best day could not repair a bubblegum machine. They are just thugs, brutish people, people we meet on The Sopranos, the guys who cannot even speak their English language, not because of their lack of phonics, it's because they don't have any brains. And so they steal and rob and beat up people. But these are not the people we meet in The Godfather. Instead, we meet Don Corleone. God, what a wonderful character in the way Brando played him. And he becomes the man, he's the Dark Prince, but he nonetheless is royalty in his culture. Okay, the same applies to Dave Robichaux. He's the knight errant who tries to give voice to those who have none. He's the figure out of the medieval morality play. sir. What were called the miracle plays sometimes. But that, I think, is at least the character as I envision him. And you see, that character really has his origins in this country in the books of James Fenimore Cooper. And of course, the Leatherstocking Tales, as these books are called, starred Natty Bumppo. But this is the Western hero who's still with us. And that contribution to early American literature actually created the film industry. All of the early films that were made borrowed from James Fenimore Cooper. All right, think of it this way. How about the film Shane? It's one of the best Western script ever written. It was an adaptation from a novel, but it was written by A.B. Guthrie, who was a friend of mine. This script is, everyone will concede that it was the patriarch of scripts when it comes to the Western story. The man with no last name appears out of nowhere. He seems to have magical powers. Jack Palance plays the role of Jack Wilson, this evil man. And it's good and evil. The battle is fought right there in that saloon. Let's back up. 1945. The wonderful story of the Earp family. My Darling Clementine with Henry Fonda. One of the best films, the best film certainly done by Ford, the great director. But what is it ultimately about? It's not about the Earp family. It's about good against evil. And eventually good will prevail. But it's also about mortality. The last scene in My Darling Clementine is the most poignant I've ever seen in my life. And I see, my wife and I see all films, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Speaking of the good, bad, and ugly, and the character from out of nowhere with no last name, who does that remind you of? It's Clint Eastwood. He is playing an extension of the characters I just mentioned. That man that comes out of nowhere and brings justice to the society, and then he disappears. And he leaves behind great lines like, "You just don't listen, do you, punk?" And you see the fist come into the camera. That's in the first Dirty Harry film. What a moment. You don't listen, do you?
But it is interesting what you say, because it's a lot of those the early writers of westerns, and I'm thinking of people even like Dashiell Hammett, moved into writing private eye novels. It's almost like that Western hero in the 20th century transfers into the private eye genre. He finds his natural place there as the person who will stand up for the vulnerable, stand up for the poor, when the forces of law and order let them down. But instead of wearing a cowboy hat, he now has a fedora. Instead of a six-shooter, he now has a pistol. It's almost like the Western writers bequeathed this tradition, which people, writers like you, were very conscious of, have kept on.
Yeah. And Hammett's a good example of that. But he actually took from his own experience. As you know, he worked for the Pinkerton Agency. He was in World War I and World War II. Right after the First World War, he was sent by the Pinkertons to Butte, Montana. And of course, they were on the side of the mining interest, anti-union guys. And they were not nice guys. And Hammett saw what was being done to the miners and to the IWW, and the murder, the lynching of Frank Little, who was a wobbly. He was mutilated. It's horrible. His killers, they were goons working for the companies, but his tormentors were never caught and skated. And that's how he wrote his first novel. And so, in other words, it's a sociological story with heroes that, yes, as you said, come right out of Natty Bumppo. But Hammett was an extraordinary person. Eventually was brought up by the House Un-American Activity Committee, refused to cooperate with them, and they sent him to prison for 2 years. It ruined his health and his life. That man who was in 2 wars, and that was the bunch that we had back then in the Congress, and they're still there. Nothing has changed. Same people are still there.
What distinguishes?
Here's one thing you learn is, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Joe.
No, I said as a writer, as you learn, nothing changes. One of the most interesting historical books I've read was The History of the Church by Eusebius, who was a 4th century bishop in Rome. And he writes this wonderful portrayal of life in Rome in 350 AD. And when you start reading it, you say, because he was there, he saw the people who were murdered in the arena, these terrible things that were done to the Christians. And then you start reading it and you say, my God, it's us. The characters are like right out of a story that could have been written today. Nothing has changed. There were the people who were heroically brave in the arena. I mean, the people who were sacrificed there. And there always was the person trying to, like Nero, try to make some money any way he can. But the human personality doesn't change.
What distinguishes your work, and I accept that, and I think that there are 2 conceptions of evil in your work. The first is a very human evil. It is human greed, human anger, human envy. But what's unusual is that you also have a more metaphysical conception of evil. Your work encompasses conceptions of the supernatural, of worlds beyond this one. I'm thinking particularly of A Private Cathedral, which is among possibly the most supernaturally inclined of your work, of your book so far, with a killer machete, or whatever we may call him, who seems to exist simultaneously in different periods of time. It was a very unusual path to take in mystery fiction, and still is. And I'm wondering where that came from, Jim. What are the roots of that in your work?
Well, it is a very different book. The one that is a dramatic departure from the other books, certainly in the Dave Robichaud series, but it does deal with the supernatural and elements of science fiction, of course. But it's a story about the Middle Ages that I simply updated to modern times. And one of the characters we meet is a tormentor, a executioner who worked for the various families in Italy, and as well as the Inquisition. And he journeys into the present, and he ends up in New Orleans. And he also has a prison ship. It's a medieval one with these huge oars hanging out, and these poor fellows on board who are his charges. And he is trying to redeem his soul. He regrets that he's aided many evil people over the last 400 years, including Mussolini. He shows up in an old newsreel standing next to Mussolini. But this is my metaphorical way of investigating the presence not only of evil in our society, but cruelty in the human gene pool. And it's something that I've never been able to reconcile. I don't understand it. There are people who are in the system, who represent the system. They're hired to do all the things that others don't want to do, or they don't want to see. And we try to review what happened in Nazi Germany or Nazi occupied Europe, Auschwitz. We can't explain it. These were baptized Christians who put people in ovens. How did that happen? How could they do it? And I don't have an answer, and I never have. I've never seen it. How can one group of people in the human family glow with blue fire? I mean, you know it. As soon as you see them, you say, my God, there's something holy about this person. Forget denominations. that's irrelevant at that point. There's something absolutely magical about this person. And then there's the person who has no compassion, no conscience, will do anything. And these are people I still believe usually find their place in politics and in militaristic cultures. And we still, at least I cannot, and Dave Robichaud cannot, come up with an answer. My guess is, my father used to believe this, that we do not all descend from the same tree. I believe they're separate gene pools. There was not one group. There were several groups. And the genes, well, I'm not qualified to speak. I have no authority on the subject. But my guess is there are people who are born that way. Psychiatrists usually throw up their hands and they're not treatable. There may be explanations, like, for example, childhood trauma, injury to the child, predation in the family. Yeah, all those things are players, but usually when we get into the greater story, we discover that people who went through those experiences turned out to be great human beings, but others did not. And there are things, you know it, you shake hands with that person and it's like black electricity going up your arm. You know it. You step back from it. A tuning fork starts to tremble in your chest, and they're evil. They're absolutely evil. The ones I was at a fling as a journalist, and there were people I had heard about, politicians that did bad things. I remember one in particular. He executed 4 men in Carolina court. He was a judge before he became a politician. Man of enormous power because he was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee when I attended a breakfast for him. And I thought, I want to see this fellow up front, right? Just look at him, hear him talk. And then I realized he talked all right. He had 2 subjects that I heard him mention: the media and people who were on welfare. He didn't like either one of them. And I'll never, anyway, he got really passionate at the table. And he said, this is a literal quote: "Why, the media obsessive. When John Kennedy was killed, that's all they talked about for days. And I thought, I turned this man neck. I said, did he just say that? He said, yep, you got it. This is the guy that put Spiro Agnew on the ticket. This was the guy. And you say, it's not, look, you think you're going to meet Satan and you find out you're talking to Elmer Fudd or an empty closet with moths flying around in it. You can't even be mad at the guy.
But Jim, how do you? One of the things that recurs, particularly in the Robichaud books, is Robichaud's faith, Robichaud's Catholic faith, and there are references again and again in the books to going to church, to the importance of his faith in his life, and I know that that's a reflection of your own deep faith. How do you reconcile what you've just told me with your own faith? Especially, and I don't want to go too deeply into it, but you've also had, obviously, you've suffered loss this year. How does somebody like you reconcile that? Those two, which seem to be 2 completely conflicting things: a belief in possibly a benevolent God, and yet the presence of this incredible evil that you explore in your own work.
Well, I've learned, if I've learned anything in life, and I haven't learned a great deal. And I always say, if wisdom comes with age, it flew right past me. But Dave Robichaud puts it well. He says he never learned the answers to the great mysteries. That's it. I've never learned, and maybe others have, but I've never learned the answer to the great mystery, the nature and mind of God. In fact, when I hear people begin to tell me what, and I'm guilty of this as well, but when I hear people telling me about the nature and mind of God, I kind of ease away from them because I do not have an answer. I mean, why do the good suffer? I don't know. This is my feeling. There's evil in the world, but most of it is because of error. And most of the people in the human race want to do good in their lives. And most are victims, not perpetrators. But there's a separate group. I do believe that. I don't think that, put it this way, I don't think the answer lies, at least for me, in metaphysical considerations. I think it's an awareness, and again, this is my personal perception. The great cathedral is all around us, and it's like Europe was before the industrial age, this country before the industrial age. The earth is a sacred place, and if a person does subscribe to the ethos in the Old Testament, we were not made to govern the earth. We were made to be its stewards. There are many admonitions in the Old Testament about the care of animals, or just the story of Noah. The first creatures who entered the ark were animals. And animals always, and there's an admonition there about the treatment of animals. But we've thrown those things over the gunwales. And a long time ago, we threw them over the gunwales. Because I like what William Faulkner said. It was a beautiful line. He said, Christianity is a really grand religion. We should try it sometime. But anyway, I think my feeling is that the best in people is there's a light inside people, and there's certain kinds of people who are born with it, others who acquire it. And I believe that good eventually will prevail. I think it's going to take a while, but I'm probably the worst person in the world to speak on the subject because I've never figured out anything. I've never figured out anything.
I admire your honesty. One of the things I wanted to ask just briefly before we open to questions was that people are so voracious in the way that they consume your work. And I know that a lot of the people already listening will have read A Private Cathedral. And so I know the question that I was asked is what next? What can we expect next from you, Jim?
Well, I have a book coming out in August of 2021 titled Another Kind of Eden. It's set in 1962 in southern Colorado, in the Trinidad area. It's a story of migrant farm workers, and it's narrated by one of my favorite characters, Aaron Holland Broussard, who is the main character in The Jealous Kind, Holland. My best three books, in my view, are Holland books. House of the Rising Sun, The Jealous Kind, and Wayfaring Stranger. And this will be the fourth. I've written earlier Holland books as well, based on my family. My grandmother was Alifair Holland, and I named my daughter Alifair, but we named her Alifair, my wife and I. But it's quite a book, this one that's forthcoming, and it's very unusual. I've never written one like it. deals in part with the massacre at Ludlow, Colorado, in 1914. When the miners tried to organize, and the Colorado militia and John D. Rockefeller's goons killed a number of people. There's a monument still there where people died in a cellar. It's a terrible story, but that's what the corporations were doing back then. They're still here. They're the same. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Not one dead, burned thing has changed.
Has your writing changed over the years, Jim? Do you think?
No,
Is
I
that
don't
the
think
way you
so.
write, or your approach to it?
Oh, I think it's maybe I see the world a little more correctly, but in terms of prose, I don't think an artist changes, or I don't think his work changes, it grows, or that's what should happen. When I was younger, I saw the world darkly and, for a while, and I think I see it in a better light today, but I also
Yeah,
feel
like
trepidation.
1 minute.
Okay, well, I kind of ran on, but,
No.
but are there people wanted to ask a question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Hello, Erica. Did you want to put in?
Well, I think we had a question that James asked, but I don't think you got to answer. And that was, did you hear it before? Both of you have major character.
Yeah, I heard it, but I just got interested in listening to Jim's answer and thought, well, that's a much better answer than I would have given anyway.
Well, we want to hear from you as well.
Well, I always think that one of the things that fascinates people is to watch flawed people overcome their flaws and not be ground down by the worst that they do. A bit like Jim, I have some experience of working in prisons. It's one of the things that I've always enjoyed doing, working with prisons. And the more you do that, the more reluctant you become to judge people by their failings, to judge people by the worst thing that they do. I've often said that if we judge each other by the worst thing that we do, half of us will be behind bars and the other half will have no friends. It's a very, the older I get, the more I cleave towards the New Testament view of people, and the more I don't want to go back to the Old Testament God. And so for me, when I write about Parker, what fascinates me about him is that have a way to channel that into empathy.
Okay, I think we lost John again for a second.
Story.
Oh, I hear. There he is.
Sorry. So anyway, I think God doesn't want me to answer that question clearly.
Well, can you give us a little bit, since The Dirty South just came out?
Yeah.
Some people, I think, some of your fans haven't had a chance to read it yet. Is there a little insight you can give for what they can expect?
A little bit like Jim, we have this in common with our most recent books, in that we have both gone back to an earlier period in the lives of our characters. I know Jim has gone back, I think, to the early part of this century with Robichaud. And I went back to 1997 for The Dirty South. I wanted to write about a younger Parker. I often said that one of the difficulties with writing a series is that you end up like Jacob Marley. You begin hauling the character's history around with you like chains and boxes. And sometimes to go back is to relieve yourself of some of that obligation to write with the history in mind. And to write about a younger, angrier man. And to give people, I suppose, an entry point. I realize as well that sometimes it can be quite intimidating for readers to come across a series that's already got 17 or 18 books in. You feel like you're joining a conversation that's been going on for a long time, or a joke that everybody understands.
Yeah.
And so I want to give people an entry point. If they chose to read my books, here was a point that you could start easily.
Okay. Well, I do have another question. This is for both of you. How do you feel about people drawing art of your characters?
Go ahead.
Have you seen
John?
any? Yeah.
Can John go ahead? Or
I think
looks like the camera is frozen.
Yeah, I think it's a little frozen. Do Do you have an answer, James?
Okay.
Have you?
Okay, so I'm sorry. Could you say the last?
How do you
Pardon, I didn't get the
feel?
question.
How do you feel about people drawing art of your characters? So I guess making your characters into art.
You
And have
mean
and I don't know if you,
sketching them?
yeah, I think that's what they might mean is sketching or making it could be like a portrait or some sort of art. How do you feel about an
Well, if
artist's
it's on the marquee of
interpretation
a
of your
theater, I
character?
really.
Pardon?
if, so if it's on the if the sketch ends up on the
On the
marquee of
big screen?
a motion picture theater, that's just wonderful.
You're right. Okay, well, let me see. I have another one here. Both of your characters can be brutal. Where does that grow from? And we'll ask John when we get
Well,
him back. We'll ask him to.
I see. Well, I guess we're talking about two kinds of characters. I don't know if the person asking the question is talking about the protagonist or the antagonist.
Mhm.
Uh, Dave Robichaux, in fact, the narrators of all of my books share the same characteristics, that if they act in a violent way, it is on the behalf of another and in
Mhm.
behalf of the innocent. And all of them always indicates that violence is the alternative, the first alternative of a frightened and
Mhm.
vulnerable person, and it is the last alternative of a confident and principled person. But nonetheless, it's always a defeat.
Mhm.
And most of the violence in my work actually is off camera. Hemingway put it
Yeah.
well: do it with 3 cushion shots.
Okay. And I have this isn't from the audience. I think we have while we're waiting for more questions from the audience. I have a question. Do you ever reread your favorite books? Not books from other authors that are your favorites. Do you ever go back and reread them?
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've read For Whom the Bell Tolls. I
Right.
didn't know that John McCain did that with. That was his favorite novel.
Oh yeah.
That's
I
right.
didn't know that either.
But I thought it was Hemingway's best work.
Mhm.
And, you can learn for people who want to be writers. It's a lesson you learn early on. Read only the best in other writers. Never read bad material. It'll mess you up.
Right.
Never make compromises on style. And
Mhm.
Hemingway's a great person to learn from, like Faulkner was, and
Mhm.
Fitzgerald. He just wrote very well.
Yeah. I
Hey,
had.
James M. Cain,
Mhm.
uh, he wrote as well as Ernest Hemingway. He wrote, oh golly, A Double Indemnity, and The Postman Always Rings Twice. No one could write better than this man. They could write
Yeah.
as well, but they couldn't write
Right.
better.
Never better.
But he's not looked at much anymore. But if a person wants to learn how to write a crime novel, James M. Cain.
Well, that funny you said only read what you like. I have another question. What is your favorite book about writing? That book that you go back to time and time again. So you reread For Whom the Bell Tolls, but is there a book actually about writing that you go back to time and time again? You refer to?
No, I've never
No,
I've never read one.
no,
I don't think that's the way to go.
no. Okay.
I don't think that's the way to go. You can maybe learn tricks from people, but if you have to learn how to, if someone has to tell a person how to write, I mean, it depends on what the person, but no, it's not art. It's something else.
Right.
It's formula.
Okay.
Formula. If you look, one rule: if a person wants to create art, not just something that's entertainment, that if you find yourself doing things that other people are doing, stop immediately.
Right.
It's not going anywhere. Not in terms of art. There are people, well, this very famous writer who hires a half dozen people, they manufacture the book. I'm not knocking it. It serves some kind of purpose, but it's not art.
Right.
It's not art.
So, John, I'm not sure if you've heard the last couple questions. If we can get you.
I presume it was about writing, and
Yeah, one question was, what is your favorite book about writing? The one that you go back to time and time again. And then,
I've never read a book about writing. I've never wanted to
Okay.
read a book about writing. It's just not something that would ever strike me to do. But if you find a book like that helpful, then that's wonderful. The only one I've ever come close to was a book that George V. Higgins wrote, and I only read it because it had a copy of a great short story in it by called "Girls in Their Summer Dresses," which I'm trying to remember, which I just think is one of the finest short stories I'd ever written. And so I accidentally read the bits about writing in that while I was trying to find the short story. But mostly, I think you learn by reading.
Yeah.
And I think you learn by reading good writers. And you learn by always trying to read people who are better than you are at what you do.
Which is what James was saying before, too.
Yeah, and I don't accept people who say, well, I don't want to be influenced by people. You're not going to be influenced, not in that way. You will pick up good habits, and you will pick up, by osmosis, you will learn how sentences are constructed. You will pick up the use of language. But the other advice I have is that I remember Ray Bradbury once said that professionals are amateurs who finish things. And I think that there is a temptation among young writers and people starting out. We have so many ideas. Ideas aren't the currency for writers. Time is the currency for writers. We will always have more ideas than we will ever use. And writing a book or a short story or a poem or an essay is a difficult thing. It is more difficult than it's given credit for. And you will begin a new book or a new short story with a great deal of enthusiasm. We all do. You enter it with, because it's novelty. It's like a new relationship. You go, look at her. She's much more interesting than the last one. Look how pretty she is, and she understands me. And then about 2 weeks into the relationship, you think, my God, I don't like the way she eats her soup. Writing a book is a little bit like that. You start with enthusiasm, and then maybe 20,000 words into it, sometimes a little bit, it becomes work. You have to work hard at it. And that's the point where I think a lot of young writers are tempted to give up. And you'll hear a little voice in your head that's the siren call of the new idea. And it's going, well, set that one aside. Here I am. That one was never as interesting as you thought it would be. I'm really interesting, and I will never let you down. And so your temptation is to put aside what you started and begin a new project because you think, well, I went astray. If you write the first sentence of something, you need to psychologically commit to writing the last sentence. You commit to the idea and you pursue it, and you recognize it will be difficult, and you recognize that you will be tempted to give up. But that's part of the process. Doubt is part of the process.
Yeah. Oh, James got to answer this question, but I want to see if you have an answer for it. It was both of your characters can be brutal. Where does that grow from?
Well, obviously I'm lovely, so it can't be anything to do with me. These are, in our books, we present sometimes idealized versions of humanity and sometimes extreme versions of humanity. And there is a little bit, sometimes in these novels, there is a little element of wish fulfillment isn't quite the way that I would put it, but sometimes there's a recognition that force and violence, depending upon how they're used, are not always unjustified. And when we write about these subjects, and it's not an exact science, my books have always been an exploration of themes. They've been an exploration of grief, an exploration of justice, and perhaps an exploration of violence and how we use violence in the world. And Parker is a man with rage. Parker is a man filled with grief and rage, and sometimes he is confronted by people who sometimes only understand rage in return. And it's not a justification for it. It is simply how, in certain. So I'm interested in exploring those themes, but I can't say that I, like Jim, I haven't come. The older I get, the less I know about things, and the happier I have to put my hands up and say, I don't really know. It's an ongoing exploration of those themes.
Right. Okay. Well, I have a final one, and this is, one second, let me get on here and read it. What do y'all do when you're not writing? How do you rest and refill the well? Do you want to start, John?
I read. I have very simple pleasures. And one of the things about lockdown and all of this dreadfulness that's happened is that it's taken away the very simple pleasures that we had, the ability to walk where you want to go out with my book for a cup of coffee and sit in a coffee shop and read and take that time away. So I have very simple things. I go to the park, I do a little bit of exercise, I read, I spend time with my dogs, and increasingly I become, one of my sons emigrated this year to be with his girlfriend and his fiance in South Africa. And I realized, I'm lucky, I realized just soon enough, I didn't want to be touring. I didn't want to be away from them. I preferred being at home with my family. And I can think a few things I like better. One of my guilty pleasures is British MasterChef. And there are a few things I like better than sitting on the couch at home with Jenny and with one or two of the kids with me and our dogs watching MasterChef. Learning to appreciate the simple pleasures in life is something that came to me very late, but soon enough to enjoy them and appreciate them.
So do you just watch, or do you whip something else up in the kitchen up yourself?
I can cook a little, but I'm not very, very good. I admire watching other people do it. And like as in most, that's why I go to restaurants. You know, you go and cook something up for you there,
and present it so nicely.
Exactly.
How about you, James? What do you do to rest and refill the well?
Well, we have a ranch or place that tries to be a ranch. It keeps me occupied. I try to work out every day physically, club, and I write. I've done that many years. I feel very fortunate today. I'm financially independent and can just concentrate on writing. The real challenge was during the time I get up early before I go work at a job. There are many things you can do well if you're tired, but to write well is not one of them. Right. So the real heroes are people who are doing that right now. They just, because you don't get a lot of encouragement as a writer. Be aware, far more people will criticize your work than will
then praise it.
That's it. Yeah. And the rejections can be very painful. Like, my novel, The Lost Get Back Boogie, was under submission over 9 years.
Right.
It was rejected over 111 times. When it was finally published by the Louisiana State Press, it was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize.
I know. And it's like, why didn't they recognize that 4 years earlier? They just needed their time. Well, it's been wonderful having both of you. And I have one other, it's a comment from Jennifer Driscoll. I love how you both have such insights regarding evil, yet to see and hear you both talk reveals what good people you are. Thank you for the inspiration and laughs.
Hey, thank you.
It's what a lovely thing to say. Thank you.
So, and again, if anyone wants to purchase The Dirty South or a Private Cathedral, there's the green button down below our screen. Click that and it'll take you to our booksellers, Ex Libris and eShaver Bookseller. And any parting words you want to give us? Any special plans for the end of the year other than to hope that next year's better?
Hoping that next year's better, and God bless people who supported bookstores during all this. Yes. It was very easy to, I know it's very easy to go onto Amazon has its place in the world and we live in an Amazon world, but to remember that, by going out and supporting your local booksellers, when they go away, those bookstores don't come back. Right. And you don't need any more mobile phone stores or Starbucks on your street.
No.
So where you can, try and give your money over the next couple of months as we come up to Christmas, maybe try and give it to the local guy rather than the big guy on the internet, if you can at all.
Yes.
Well, and I want to thank everyone out there on the internet for inviting us into their home. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
Thank you. It was an honor to have both of you with us. And I know there were a lot of people so excited to have the both of you together. The phone calls I got was like, you don't understand. They're my two favorite authors. So this was wonderful. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. It's great. Thanks, Jim.
Take
care, folks. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye. And let me close.
Bye.
So, and I want to say to everyone, thank you for joining us today. And I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Again, don't forget, purchase your copy of The Dirty South and a Private Cathedral by clicking on the link below the screen. And join us on December 16th for Michael Connolly, New York Times bestselling author of the 35 books, including his latest, The Law of Innocence. For more details, to register and purchase a copy of his book, you can go to our website, savannahbookfestival.org. Have a great weekend and happy Thanksgiving. And James, I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving.
Same to you, Erica.